Welcome back to A More Perfect Union, the Hill's 3-day virtual festival. We're on day 2, if you are counting, and we got another day of this left, but it's been awesome so far. I'm Steve Clemens. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill. Today's Focus segment will take a deep dive into the state of our economy with the current pressures brought on by the pandemic. Before we drive in, a reminder, you can tweet us at The Hill Events. It's at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillAMPU, The Hill, A More Perfect Union. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, please don't hit your computer. Just refresh the page and I think it will work. Joining me for this session is The Hill's finance reporter, Sylvan Lane. Sylvan, it's great. First time together. I don't know if you're ready for it, but I mean, it's great to have you up here, and thank you for taking on some of these heavy conversations. Are you up for it?
Oh, I'm up for it. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have some fun today. Now, we're kicking off, I think...
Yeah, we're kicking off the
we're kicking off. So you kick off.
Alrighty. Well, we are kicking off the conversation with Gita Gopinath, the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, and the first woman to have this role. Welcome.
Join you.
Thanks so much. Now, earlier this month, the IMF cut its forecast for global growth. Can you tell us about some of the main forces that are slowing the recovery from the pandemic?
So what we are seeing is a global recovery that, while it does continue, the momentum has slowed. And that was particularly true in the third quarter, but we're also seeing some of that follow into the fourth quarter. So that led to a downgrade of about 0.1 percentage point for global growth. But underlying that was more significant downgrade for the US, downgrades for Germany and for Japan. And this came from a combination of, firstly, Delta affecting people going back to certain kinds of contact-intensive activities, but also because of supply disruptions and the higher inflation that we're seeing in many countries.
Now, in the U.S., we've enjoyed a fairly quick bounce back from a lot of the damage we've taken during the pandemic, but I know that's not necessarily the case for poorer nations. Now, what more do nations like the United States need to do to help foster a more equitable recovery?
So indeed, we are seeing these very divergent speeds of recoveries, not just for the US, but I would say for most advanced economies. Our projection is for them to be back to pre-pandemic trends by the middle of next year or towards the end of next year, while for most emerging and developing countries, they have significant scarring going into the next few years. And one of the big reasons for that divergence is the inequitous access to vaccinations that remains the case, with low-income countries having less than 2% of their population fully vaccinated, while over 60% of advanced economies have full vaccination rates, are fully vaccinated. 60% of the population is fully vaccinated, and they are on to booster shots. So I would say that the foremost issue to address is solving this inequitous access, which requires delivering on the doses that they pledged that they would donate to COVAX and through that to low-income countries. Also for manufacturers to prioritize deliveries in the near term to COVAX and AVAT. And that can only happen if the countries that have surplus vaccines work together with the manufacturers.
Now, with these disparities in the recovery in mind, we also know that women have taken a much harder toll because of the pandemic-driven recession than men have. Can you explain a little bit about why that's the case?
So in the peak of the crisis last year, what we saw uniformly across the world is a bigger drop in female employment as compared to male employment. And one important reason was the fact that women tend to work in sectors that are, the hospitality area, retail industries, and so on. So that's where the concentration of hit to jobs were, and that's where women worked. And so that's where we saw an important fall. But a second important source of the difference was that women remained the primary caretakers at home. So when schools closed down, it was women who had to stay home to make sure that the children's education still continued, and any other kind of caregiving that needed to be provided fell disproportionately on women. And now only looking at the recovery, you do see recoveries coming back. You see women returning back to the labor force. But again, even in the US, we're seeing women's labor force participation come back slower than for men. And these hurdles remain, including in terms of making sure that daycares are open so that then women can return to work, making sure schools run on a regular basis. All of these issues are still holding back women's full return to the labor force.
And with that in mind, can you tell me about how the emergence of the Delta variant in June and July started to change the picture of the economic recovery?
So what we saw in June and July was the fact that cases started going up and dramatically in different parts of the world, though not all at the same time. So that, first of all, held back the recovery in the travel sector. Previously, we were seeing people traveling a lot more, but again, that dampened that recovery. Also, in terms of people returning to restaurants, that also we saw that slowing. At the same time, the Delta variant was also now creating significant waves in Asia, in East Asia, which are the manufacturing hubs of the world. That led to supply side disruptions, shipping delays. So again, these are the kinds of effects that we've seen disrupt economic activity in many parts of the world.
And speaking of those shipping delays, we've seen inflation, increase not only in the United States, but across the world. Can you talk to me a little bit about why this inflationary pressure has persisted a little bit longer than some economists have thought, and, when we might see it start to finally ease up a little bit?
Now, we expected to see, high inflation numbers because of the fact that there was a deep recession last year and prices have fallen for many goods, including for commodity prices. So some of that return in demand and in growth, the recovery in commodity prices just led to an increase in inflation. What we continue to see, of course, is this mismatch between supply and demand. So you had the deep recession last year. Now demand has bounced back. There's pent-up demand. There's also a considerable amount of policy support that was provided that held up household balance sheets and is leading to higher spending. But supply hasn't come back as strongly in multiple sectors. And of course, there are the semiconductor chips where, again, there's widespread shortages, and you're seeing that in car production and purchases. But you're also seeing that in delivery lags and shipping delays. So that's also feeding into the headline inflation numbers. We're again seeing energy prices going up. So as long as we have this friction that we're seeing between supply and demand, some of which we expect will resolve itself in the next few months, some will take longer, we are going to see elevated levels of inflation into the middle of next year.
And our last question, how soon do you think, the world might start to see in a global economy that resembles more what we saw before the pandemic? How long is it going to take to get to the other side of this, you think?
I'd say there's tremendous uncertainty around that, but we know what needs to be done. What needs to be done is to make sure that we get to widespread vaccinations around the world. We have vaccines, we have multiple successful vaccines, and now supply is strongly coming back up. So we need to make sure that we vaccinate the world fully, make sure that the antivirals, the new medications that are coming out are available more broadly, because then we can go back to some form of greater normalcy in individual lives and therefore in the world economy also.
Well, Gita, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk about all of this with us. And thank you for helping us make a little bit more sense of this very confounding economy.
Thank you, Sylvan. It was a pleasure to join you.
Thank you.